Hello and welcome to this week's memory work review for the 5th grade confirmation class. This week we are going to be looking at the final two commandments, the 9th and 10th commandment. They're related to each other, both about coveting. So let's look at the memory work for this week. The 9th commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not scheme to get our neighbor's inheritance or house, or get it in a way which only appears right, but help and be of service to him in keeping it. And then the 10th commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or maidservant, his ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not entice or force away our neighbor's wife, workers, or animals, or turn them against him, but urge them to stay and do their duty. Well, the challenge of the 9th commandment is that it is easy to confuse with the 7th commandment. They're both talking about property. And I'll be honest, even I sometimes get the two jumbled in my head a bit. I will say that if you know the 7th commandment well, especially the thing about improve and protect his property and income, the IPPI, it'll help you to be like, no, that can't be right. It has to be in this one. The big difference here is that we're talking about kind of the desirous heart working hard to get something away. It's a little bit more insidious than just stealing. It's using deceptive practices to get these things away. So we should fear and love God so that we do not scheme to get our neighbor's inheritance or house. So we use that term scheme to kind of hang on to the first part, or get it in a way which only appears right. And so we have two very long phrases here, but those are the two things that we ought not to do. Do not scheme to get our neighbor's inheritance or house. And so those two things, inheritance or house, or get them in a way which only appears right. But then the but, and it's always important to kind of break this into those chunks. The but tells us then what we should do. But help and be of service to him in keeping it. So we have two things we should be doing positively as well. We shouldn't be scheming or getting in a way which only appears right, but we should help and be of service to him in keeping it. And so I think, again, as you just count those things out and work through it using the echo method, that will help it not just to be words in your head or in your child's head, but actually a collective thought in that regard. The 10th commandment. Well, this is always the fun one because the commandment itself is long. But you can see that you can break it easily down into chunks. And the kids do this. We say that in my class, we say the 10 commandments every time we get together. And they know this commandment because it does kind of hang together in the brain okay. There's 5 things being said, but really just 3. And our brain naturally links them together, right? You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant or maidservant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And you hang it all together that way. Unlike being about property, this is about people. And I think that is significant, and why these two commandments are divided out from each other is that it's not just about the property of life, but it is about people too. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not entice or force away. There's the carrot and the stick. Force away. And then he restates those 3 categories. Our neighbor's wife, workers, or animals. Or turn them against him. Right? So that's the third thing. We don't entice, force away, or turn them against him. But inside there, he does restate those 3 categories of our neighbor's wife, workers, or animals. But, and again, this breakdown of now we're going to what we should do, but urge them to stay and do their duty. So we urge them to do what? Stay, remain where they are, and do their duty. And so if we break it up in that way and continue to use the echo method, I think this one will hang very well in your head because, again, some of the language and patterns flow out of the commandment itself. Well, let's look at the vocabulary for this, for these 2 commandments. First off, we have the word covet. What does it mean to covet? Well, It means to want what others have. And again, that's different than saying, somebody shows you their new iPhone and you say, oh, I'd like to have that too. That's not necessarily coveting. That's just you kind of being made aware of something that may be desirous to have. But when you see it and you're like, I need to have theirs, or it puts a hunger in your heart to say, I need to be like them and have that phone. Those would be covetous thoughts. And you can see how it's all about the intentions of the heart, as so many of these things are. It's okay to want something that somebody else has if it's simply the utility of it that you desire. But if it's the status of it, if it's the power or prestige you think it might bring, then all of a sudden we are getting into coveting territory. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. Well, what do we mean here by house? Really, we mean all their property, which is why this is so intricately linked to the seventh commandment. The seventh commandment protects our property, and then as does the ninth commandment. It is where we live, but it's also the stuff we have, the good things that God has blessed us with. God blesses individuals with property. And it's not okay for us to desire to take those things from them. Instead, we work together to share in the bounty of God's goodness and richness. Well, we should fear and love God so that we do not scheme. Scheme's a good word. It means trickery or a plot, right? And so if your parents have ever talked, or you can talk to your kids about the emails that you sometimes get about Nigerian princes or things like that, right? Saying, "Oh, if you give me $5,000, I will send you $5 million." That kind of silliness. Well, that's a scheme, right? And it uses deception and all of those things to make it happen. And we can all kind of fall into scheming. Well, if only this, that, or the other thing would fall into place, I could have this stuff that I so desperately want in my life. The real funny thing about all of this is, as an aside, is that as we scheme for all of this stuff, what happens when we finally get it? We find that we're not entirely satisfied by it, aren't we? We think that this will make everything okay, and then we get it and we think, oh, now I need something else, right? And that's the important idea behind coveting. Saint Paul said, I did not know what sin was until I understood coveting. And I think that's very telling. Because he began to understand his own heart and his desires and its hunger for something. We try to fill that with stuff, but what we find out is that really what we're missing is God. And there's a reason why the 9th and 10th commandments help frame the 10 commandments with the first commandment. You shall have no other gods. Well, what is coveting? It's the things that our heart is inclined to make into other gods. Well, what are we trying to get? Your neighbor's inheritance or house. Well, we already explained house, but what is inheritance? It is the property that you have, that you've built up, that's not temporary. It's meant to be passed on to others, usually to your children, but sometimes it's passed on to a charity or the church or other people. But it's theirs, and it's theirs to give to whom they wish. And we ought not to begrudge them for who they give it to. It's an interesting thing. I run into this in the church an awful lot, that families are often broken over the family inheritance because one brother or sister got more than their fair share or took advantage. They used scheming, perhaps, to get more than they deserved, and it left a lasting wound on the family. And so you can see how deadly coveting truly can be. Or appears right. And again, we always try to put on a veneer that, I'm doing the right thing, but then it turns out for our advantage, and we know that, and we let that advantage happen for us. Jesus teaches us that we should give to others and live our lives generously, not trying to advance ourselves. Why? Because God is taking care of us. And so you see how dangerous coveting is, because it makes us think that this stuff of life is what's going to see us through. But of course, the stuff of life will pass away. It has to, right? The old adage, you can't take it with you, but we kind of live our lives as if we could. And that is the great danger of coveting things. Well, what about the 10th commandment, coveting people and perhaps their position? How do we unpack this? Well, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. I actually had this question from my 6th and 7th graders yesterday on this. Why are they assuming that this commandment is being kept by a man, by a husband? And I had to talk to them about how up until, 50 years ago, it was very common to use man and he and him as fill-in words for he, she, him, her, right? Man, woman. We've, in our modern sensibilities, have decided that we want to be more inclusive in our language. I was really brought into that only partially in my upbringing. So it's still natural for me when I read him or her, or when I read him, that I read it as him, her, and it's not objectionable to me. But I think for our kids sometimes it can be, because they're more immersed in that. And again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's an interesting transition. The language of Hebrews, or of the language of Hebrew, always made those assumptions. So did the language of Greek. Honestly, I don't know of a language that didn't make those assumptions until very recently in our history. And so it's something we're kind of stuck with from the Catechism, but do take the time to unpack that when it says we should not covet our neighbor's wife, included in that is the idea of a husband as well. A wife towards her husband is the same idea as the husband towards his wife. All right. Manservant, maidservant, well, Luther explains this himself in the meaning. Workers, people under your employ. And ox or donkey, again, Luther explains that. Animals. It is interesting that animals kind of get their own consideration in this, though, isn't it? Animals are an interesting place in our lives as Christians. They're a wonderful gift of God. We have our dog Roosevelt, and we love him very much. He certainly isn't at the same level as our children, but we do recognize that some of these animals that God brings into our lives, one, help greatly to with our work burden. Maybe less so now, but there's a reason why the power that we find in our vehicles, our tractors and our cars, is called horsepower, right? Because we appreciate how much the horse did to alleviate our workload. But we also appreciate the love and comfort that dogs and cats can bring as well. So that brings us into the meaning itself. We should fear and love God so that we do not entice or force away. I already kind of gave this away a little bit. The entice is the carrot. The force away is the stick, right? And what we mean by that, of course, is the carrot kind of says, oh, do you want this nice thing? Come follow it. Come follow over to where I am so that I can capture you, right? Maybe not physically, but kind of emotionally or with what I'm offering, right? If you wave enough money or enough prestige or whatever to draw them away. It's more fun over here. Come over here. The stick is do this or else. Something bad will happen, right? So enticing promises something good for you departing. Force away promises something bad if you don't comply with what is being done. All right. So we do not entice or force away our neighbor's wife, workers, or animals, or turn them against him, right? Make them hate him, but urge them to stay. Urge, which really says, hey, look, think this through very much. And this, as a pastor, I have to do that when a wife is contemplating divorce or a husband contemplating divorce. I have to urge them to stay, to work through it. Let's talk together. Let's have counseling. Let's do these things so that we don't just throw away this relationship that's happening. And I say that in full knowledge, of course, that there is sin and there's failures in marriages. Husbands fail wives, wives fail husbands. Of course they do. We're sinners. But to try to bring us to a place of forgiveness, that really is the heart of the urging, is let us forgive and strive to do better, right? As Christ calls us to do. But I know in our modern world, we sometimes, one, struggle to forgive. And even as we are forgiven, we sometimes really struggle to try to do better. We fall back into our old traps and old failings and continue to let people down. And so we need that constant urging to remain where God has planted us to be and where we have promised to be in what we do. Urge them to stay and do their duty. Now, this is very much vocational language, and I would say that this is the commandment that really grounds our vocational ideas. What is the duty of a worker to his employer? What is the duty of a husband to a wife? What is the duty of a wife to a husband? What is the duty of animals, right? And the Bible would say, well, certainly don't just beat and abuse them, help them, but they need to do their work, right? As far as animals, with people though, it's a bit more complex, isn't it? I don't want you to feel like this commandment is a trap. Your duty as a worker doesn't mean that you have to work for a person no matter what happens. You have the freedom in Christ to find new employment, but to do it in the right way. With your head held high in a God-pleasing way. And so we have a duty that flows out of our love for God to do things properly. And the Bible has a lot to say on that, and we'll explore that more, especially when we look at the table of duties, which help unpack that in your catechism. But if you're more curious about what our duties are, I would look at the table of duties in your catechism to help understand that. In fact, let me give you the reference here. It's at the very beginning of the catechism, after what we call the 6 chief parts. It's section 3 on page 33, the table of duties. Take the time to read through that and see what duties people have. All right. Well, I hope that you found that helpful. Continue diligently on your memory work. I get good reports all the time from the elders that things are going well. God bless you in the week ahead.